Well, first, my name is Rabbi Abraham Cooper. I came with Rabbi Marvin Heyer back in 1977 to help found the Simon Wiesenthal Center. And our educational arm is the Museum of Tolerance. That's been open for 20 years, about 5 million visitors. Most of my responsibilities have to do with issues and also in combining responses to the problems, meaning that we have educational product. We have traveling exhibits. We have Mariah films. 2 of our documentaries won Academy Awards. So we're big believers in mass education. We also train law enforcement. And I head up a project called Digital Terrorism and Hate, which for the last 15 years analyzes how hate and terror groups leverage internet technologies. Beyond that, with the resurgence of anti-Semitism today in Europe, I've spent considerable time in recent months, 3 times in France, Germany, Norway. I just came back from Budapest. And it's kind of like new old anti-Semitism. So we're a teaching institution, a non-traditional kind of teaching institution. We don't give degrees, but we try to communicate with people in a direct way. And but we're also an outspoken, proactive Zionist, what's called an NGO, a non-governmental organization. We have full status at the United Nations, at UNESCO, at other kinds of agencies. So we get a lot of the bad news early. We experience some of it directly, and my job is to try to help forge with strategies that can make a difference and help to change educate them and change the way people look at a particular question. Let me talk about the United States. Going around and speaking with leaders around the world, they're always quick to say, well, you have your own problems at home, and they're right. We have plenty of hate crimes in the United States. California's the largest state, which means that we're probably going to lead the league almost every year. The trends, which are confirmed as recently as the 2011 statistics nationally, the #1 target for race-based hate attacks in this country are African Americans. And in 2011, 66% of the hate crimes that were based on religious affiliation were against less than 2% of the population, against the Jews. So the greatest country ever conceived of, the United States. It is the strongest democracy still. I'm very proud to be an American. And we all have to realize that a part of our social fabric also has to do with the bigotry. And the test is how well we deal with it in marginalizing the forces of hatred. Now, in Europe and around the world, it's, I think, a more complicated situation, and in some places, a much more threatening environment. And you can't sort of overly generalize. So let me talk, for example, about the largest Jewish community in Europe, France. Today, the French government, the police, the intelligence agencies, they realize that the threats against the Jewish community not only threaten 700,000 Jews, but they threaten the very fabric of French society, their value system. Most of those threats come from people like Mohammed Merah, who was an Islamist terrorist, who murdered a young rabbi and a couple of kids in Toulouse schoolyard, a Jewish school, including grabbing an 8-year-old girl by her hair and executing her. And before he was killed, said that, we're at a war. His war is against the Jewish people, not just against France. So while we may have now the full attention of the authorities, who are trying their best, there are no guarantees that there's a future for Europe's largest Jewish community. I just came back from Hungary. Hungary has its own checkered history vis-a-vis the Jews. It was the last intact Jewish community during the Holocaust. More or less, there were about 60,000 Jews who died, were killed between 41 and 44. But compared to the rest of Europe, there were 800,000 Jews. And in 1944, that means, if you want to put it in context, when we had D-Day and we thought that the end was near, Eichmann and the others were just getting started, and hundreds of thousands of Jews were sent over one railroad track from Hungary to Auschwitz and gassed. It was a great Christian hero by the name of Raoul Wallenberg, who came from Sweden. He helped directly and indirectly to save about 100,000 Jews. So Hungary today is a democracy. It was part of the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. And it's a very confused society because they have to finally have the opportunity sort of create their, or recreate their national identity. And the question is, what part of their past will they embrace and what parts will they reject? Well, 17% of the voters voted for the Jobbik Party. The Jobbik Party is a Nazi party, basically. And they celebrate that part of their past, which included turning on their own Jews. They persecute the Roma, otherwise known as gypsies. They hate Jews, and confirmed, actually, when we called them on it this past week, that, yes, they feel very close to Iran. So there in Hungary, you have more traditional anti-Semitism, including some of it based in theology, Christian theology, and their own history. And there we're talking about the second largest Jewish community in that region, and the largest in Central Europe, 100,000 Jews. One other example, just to give you the diversity, is that we have put a city of Malmö, which is the third largest city in Sweden, on what we call our travel advisory list. We tell Jewish people, if you're going to Malmö, be very careful, because basically the police won't do anything if there's an anti-Semitic incident. The young rabbi there, his wife and children, hundreds of cases of incidents. We met with the mayor, the police chief, the prosecutors, and the mayor of that city, I think, made a decision, not being pressured by anyone, that since there are only 700 Jews and many, many, many more thousands of Muslims, he assumed that if he would sort of let the Jews twist in the wind, that would win him more support. By the way, I'm not sure that's the case. When I visited with leaders in the Muslim and Roma community, they also felt they were left as minorities, as outsiders looking in. So, but there you have, we're talking about three democracies. This is not the Iron Curtain. We're talking about democracies. People go and vote. They pay their taxes. We talk about equality before the law, etc. Not so simple. And even in Copenhagen, one of the few bright spots in World War II, when the Christian population of that country stood up and said, you're not going to kill our Jews, and basically got 99% of the Jewish population over to neutral Sweden. Some of them put their lives in danger. Today in Copenhagen, I couldn't wear my yarmulke in public. You can't wear a piece of Jewish jewelry that would indicate that you're of the Jewish faith. And if you speak Hebrew, in some neighborhoods, you're really asking for trouble. So we have in many different locations, for a variety of reasons, a resurgence of anti-Semitism and not enough of a response from the powers that be, meaning the elected officials, meaning the police, meaning the media. It is not yet an issue that I can say. Think about forest fires. They're not really contained, and they represent a real challenge. Now, a part of that challenge comes by virtue of the demonization of the Jewish state, in which the media and some public personalities, including some Jews, say that, depending if you're talking to an academic, Israel was a colonial mistake that should be reversed. After World War II, there was just a mistake made, and they never should have given that land to the Jews. You have the Palestine Kairos document being circulated in theological circles in all of the churches, which takes a page from a similar document written against apartheid South Africa that basically wraps a political agenda in a theological wrapping and says that Israel, the Christians who support Israel, are guilty of a sin, that they have to repent and essentially revert back to a mindset and to a theological approach that was actually the mainstream Christian thought, I think right up until the Holocaust, which is, let's put it politely, that the Jewish covenant with God ran out or was canceled. And therefore Jews, the Jewish people, do not have a future, don't deserve one, and have no legitimacy. So in this case, very dangerous maneuver. If it gets traction, it can help even bring more anti-Semitism, where right now we have a tremendous base of support. So the Palestinians and their supporters are very, very hard at work at trying to communicate to evangelicals in the United States and to basically say, look, you got it wrong. You shouldn't be supporting the Jewish state of Israel. You should be supporting the people who suffered the most, who are, you know, the real victims here, and that would be the Palestinians. So we have, I think one other element that would be useful for your viewers is also to understand how do you know when you've crossed the line between legitimate criticism of the policies of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism? If you've been to Israel, and I know that you have, you know that there is a hyperactive media. You go into the taxi and the cab driver will give you what it is that's bugging him that morning. The Knesset, the parliament, can be quite raucous. So the idea that criticizing Israeli policies makes you an anti-Semite would more or less move most of the 6 million Jews in Israel into that category. So how do you know when you go from legitimate criticism in a vibrant democracy to something that's much worse? It's terrible. Natan Sharansky, the famous former Soviet refusenik, a human rights icon, and now the head of the Jewish Agency in Israel, he put it this way: after our horrible experiences at the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, just before 9/11, of which I was one of the spokesmen of the Jewish groups, he came up with a very simple equation. It's called the 3Ds. If a double standard is applied, if there's demonization of Israel, and if what you're listening to is delegitimizing its very right to exist, you've crossed over from valid criticism and discussion into a whole new domain. We call that, I would say, a new form of anti-Semitism. And it's very, very challenging when you speak to people who say, what do you mean? I don't have anything against Jews. I have wonderful Jewish neighbors. We get together, and they even invite me over for latkes on Hanukkah, and I visit them on Christmas. What are you talking about? So when people only hear one of the narratives, and Israel, contemporary Israel, is presented as some sort of apartheid state, big lie, that the Israelis act like Nazis, a bigger lie. It's unless you can share your narrative with those people, sooner or later, that kind of big lie tactic will yield results. And that's a snapshot of the world. My job, as I see it on a daily basis, rather complicated. It is global. And on the other hand, you know, we're very grateful for people who do stand up, and there are many who do. I spoke to a rally in Budapest on behalf of Israel. There were 6,000 Christians there. So it isn't all bleak, and you know, it isn't everyone. You know, it isn't an issue. I don't teach my grandchildren that the entire world is against us. I don't think that's true at all. But we have to do a better job of explaining what our narrative is, and in a polite and direct way, including at the UN, saying that, you know, our relationship to the land of Israel goes back at least 3,500 years. And there may be room for one state or two states. I'll leave that up to the politicians and diplomats. But insofar as the legitimacy of the Jewish people to stay connected to its land, which it always has throughout 2,000 years, that is beyond reproach and attack, even though the enemies of Israel insist that, no, today's Jews have no connection back then, or they'll argue theologically, that policy ran out. And when you hear that kind of language, the bell should be going off by saying this is not someone who's a peace seeker. This is someone who has either swallowed the Kool-Aid or is an activist on behalf of an effort to get rid of the Jewish state. Well, look, I think there are a couple of points. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion is a book that was written in the 1800s when Jews could only dream of returning and having control over the Holy Land, regaining it after 1900 years. The conspiracy theorists who blame everything that goes wrong in the world, I'm not sure they blame the horse meat scandal on the Zionists, but they'll get around to it. That is, pretty much par for the course. And very often with those kinds of conspiracy theories, demonizing the United States is very often parallel to it. When you talk about Israel, I think we have to also be very, very specific. We have, I think, nearly 20% of the population of the state of Israel is Arab. There are Arab citizens, there is an Arab Supreme Court justice, there are people who are in the parliament, etc. So when you talk about the modern democratic Jewish state of Israel, nearly 20% of the voters are indeed Arab. Now, they are living in a Jewish state, but they have their full political and communal rights. And that's the way, in fact, it should be. Is so far as the narrative that has been pushed now for a long, long time, that if only there would be a final peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, peace will break out in the Middle East. Actually, you don't hear that very much anymore. Not with 4 million displaced Syrians next door and 70,000 people dead, not with what's happened in Egypt, not with Jordan tottering on the edge and Lebanon on the verge of explosion and Tunisia a disaster area, et cetera, et cetera. We will yet hear this argument, but to make it right now in real time is so ludicrous that some of the biggest fans of that world vision somehow, if only the Jews will be cooperative and give the Palestinians what they need, want, deserve, if they would only not be so obstinate, then peace would break out. Well, the fact of the matter is that right now Israel is facing not the specter of a two-state solution, but a three-state solution. As Rabbi Heyer, my boss and mentor and colleague, has said, which is you have the Palestinian Authority. They're holding on by their fingernails in the West Bank. And then you have Hamas, who won't even allow the president of the PA to come and land there. So first of all, I think the most important issue, because you're not going to hear from the Wiesenthal Center that we believe that the answer to this issue is that every inch of what is the Holy Land has to stay under Jewish control. First of all, it's not for me to decide. That's up to an elected government of democratic Israel to decide what it is and how it is they're going to proceed. But, when you're setting up a wedding, we have the caterer, the United States of America. They got the hall. But to have a wedding, you need a bride and a groom. Now, Israelis, including most people from the right, are prepared for a final deal with their neighbors, and not a salami deal, but a final deal, in which they will have an Arab neighbor that cannot hurt them, means that you're not going to have a full army, means that they have an Arab neighbor that respects the fact that Jewish people have that 3,500-year relationship, and that Israelis have as much right to where they live as their Arab neighbors, the Palestinians, have to theirs. When a Palestinian leader steps forward and says that not only on CNN and not only to Israelis, but says it to his own people, you'll have a peace deal very, very quickly. And if you can't bring the bride and groom, or if the bride is the bride of Frankenstein, i.e. Hamas takes over, there isn't any Israeli leader left, right, or center, whether it's Bibi Netanyahu or someone else, who would ever enter into that kind of a deal with a group whose covenant quotes the Protocols of Zion, which is a libelous screed, and openly promotes the destruction, the genocide of the State of Israel. By the way, anyone who thinks that Hamas is actually concerned for the holy sites, as an Islamist group brought into the world by the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt. I was at the Western Wall on a Friday night a few months ago when the siren went off and the police came running in and said everybody has to leave the prayer service and get under cover. It turns out that there were 2 missiles on a Friday night fired from Gaza towards the Holy City, which means one of those missiles could have hit the Dome of the Rock. It could have hit the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It could have landed in the Western Wall. They don't give a damn about the true religious values. And they're a terrorist entity that has a lot of support, unfortunately, from the Iranians. And right now, Israelis left, right, and center just look at their neighborhood. They look at the Golan Heights. Everything that they assumed was their reality 5 years ago is now changed. So hard to see where there's going to be some big breakthrough in terms of peace. But the truth is, if there'll ever be some sort of Palestinian Sadat, if neighbors finally say, enough of this, let's make this work, there's plenty of room for everyone and a couple of million people more in the future generations. As you know, it's a very blessed land, and Israelis are bringing more blessing every day, not only through the land, but through the collective genius and technology and biotech. And it's just absolutely incredible to watch the, the reuniting of Jewish people with their land. And I just want to emphasize again one more thing for the record. When we say it's their land, unlike countries like Jordan and Syria, it's illegal for Jews to own land in Jordan. In terms of Israel, yes, it is, quote unquote, the land of the Jewish people, but it's also a modern democracy with the rule of law, and almost 20% of its population that is not Jewish. And it's been that way since '48. If you really want to understand sort of where the challenges are, it's an imperfect democracy, as every government that runs by what Winston Churchill said about democracy, right? The worst form of government, except for every other form of government. So that being the case, we would hope that Friends of Israel will redouble their support. And for people who aren't sure, try to learn a little bit more, and also try to make your way to the Holy Land to take claim for part of your own spiritual legacy. It's just there waiting for people to come. It's the only place in the Middle East where all religious service is protected, all religious sites are protected, and all religions have rights, all of the religions. And we'd hope that people would go with their eyes open and their hearts open and ignite a love affair between the Holy Land and themselves. Well, I co-authored an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal recently with a colleague of mine here at the Wiesenthal Center, a member of the Christian clergy, in which we focused on the fact that nearly 200 million Christians are being persecuted around the world. Now, it's kind of strange for Americans to say, what do you mean, a Christian minority? We're not a minority, we're a majority here. That's true. But around the world, things are quite different. You have in Nigeria, the Boko Haram terrorist group that targets Christians at prayer when they're saying Mass, and come and suicide bomb churches and pull Christian students out of a college dorm and shoot them down, just kill them on the spot. You have 10 million Coptic Christians in Egypt who don't know if they have a future under this Muslim Brotherhood-dominated government. You have the ethnic cleansing already almost complete in sections of Iraq, of historic Christian community, and then obviously Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan. It really is a disaster. So first of all, we speak out because we're a human rights group. But one of the points we made during a meeting with a senior White House official who's in charge of human rights and related areas, we took out part of our time to focus on it and to basically say that there is no more important goal or human right than the protection of religious minorities. It's very simple. If a family leaves its home on a Friday, Shabbat, Saturday, or Sunday, goes to their house of worship, they should be able to do that, pray, come home without threat of intimidation, violence, or terrorism. That should be the baseline for our financial support for any country overseas. We should use it as a leverage. We should be bringing it up as Americans in every international forum. And by the way, I really do believe this, that even for people who don't yet believe in God, this is a basic human right, because if we can't protect, I'm not interested in protecting religions. I think we have to make sure we can protect the religious, for them to pray in the way in which they're accustomed to. Right now, that simple, seemingly simple right is under attack all over the world. And I would hope that more Christians here in the United States would speak out when these kinds of attacks take place. And because when you add up all the people in the United States who say they're Christian, if they wanted to make sure that our political and social establishment took this as a priority, they actually have a lot more clout than a couple of Zionists hanging out in Los Angeles. But we see that as a absolute litmus test for our collective future. In any country, if a religious minority cannot be protected, if people fear for simply fulfilling their religious, spiritual, and communal goals that don't impact negatively on anyone else, then we're all in trouble. And that's a trend that we see, that as a place called the Simon Wiesenthal Center, we feel a moral obligation to speak out.